Now, let's take a look at this geography. Russia is huge, and we might wonder why it's so big. But if you actually look at the geography of Russia, it makes sense why it would be so big. First of all, the vast majority of the landscape is more than 250 miles away from the ocean. The ocean tends to have moderating factors on the climate because of wind and because of basically tidal patterns. You're able to get a more reasonable climate if you're closer to the ocean. This isn't the case with Russia. You've also got southern mountains down here that present moderating climates from the south, and you have flatlands here which don't prevent Arctic temperatures from coming in. So Russia is cold. Russia is really, really cold. In fact, it has the coldest national average temperature on Earth, which is about 22 degrees Fahrenheit on average, wherever you are in Russia. That obviously gets colder if you're further north, warmer if you're further south, but for the most part, Russia's cold, and it doesn't really have as much access to the ocean as you might think. This is Arctic. This is frozen, basically. So we need to keep that in mind. So throughout the history of the Russian Empire, Russians have tried to expand. So for a period of more than 300, almost 400 years, the Russian Empire has gradually been expanding. You can check out the map here. One of the first places that Russia expanded was in Siberia, starting in the 16th century. And you could think of this in a similar way as Americans who expanded west in the 1800s. The Russians really didn't encounter a lot of resistance. A lot of that geography was just kind of flat, cold tundra. And Russians had European technology that they were basically spreading and conquering native peoples, some of the last lingering Mongol empires. And the Russians really didn't encounter any kind of resistance until they got to places like China. But the Russians reached the Pacific Ocean by about 1639. Now, what we need to keep in mind with Russian expansion is that for centuries they've been trying to get more coastal ports. Remember, Russia didn't have a lot of access to the ocean, even though we might think it has lots of coastline. So an example of this is a guy named Peter the Great. He was actually the guy who established the first Russian Empire. He called Russia an empire for the first time in about 1721. But, Peter the Great was obsessed with trying to get not just coastal access, but warm water ports. This is a picture of the Crimean beach in the Crimea, which is right on the Black Sea. Russia was always trying to get access to places like the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean and even the Pacific Ocean, which wasn't as easy as we might think. Russia, in order to try and get better access to warm waters, was also trying to expand south. And throughout the 19th century, Russian expansion was causing conflicts first with the British Empire, which had a lot of colonies there, with Central Asian tribes, especially in places like Afghanistan, and with the Ottoman Empire, which had most of the Middle East under its control. Now, with Russian expansion, they first came in contact with Japan in the late 19th century, but by 1905, Russia and Japan were in conflict over this area in Manchuria, which is just north of where Korea is today. The Japanese were, as we'll see later on in the course, had rapidly industrialized at this point for various reasons. And in fact, they were way more industrialized than Russia. The Japanese were also worried about Russian expansion, as you can see from this newspaper from 1877. But Russia was pretty much not well matched. First of all, they didn't have as much industrial power as Japan, but also Russia had to get its Baltic fleet all the way across the world, whereas Japan just had to basically cross this little sea. Although Russia had ports here, the vast majority of its fleet was focused in Europe so that it could be prepared to fight, for instance, like Britain or France, as it did in the mid-19th century. So Russia lost to Japan, which seemed like a way smaller and to the Russians a primitive kind of a culture. I mean, they looked different than Russians. They had a different culture than Russians. Russians considered themselves, for the most part, European, or at least Western Russians did. So this really shook up Russia, and it helped lead to the 1905 revolution in Russia, which we'll discuss later. But what we need to keep in mind is that by the time World War I broke out, the Russians were trying to rapidly industrialize. For the most part, they had been this like farming society, and their loss to Japan had really kind of woken up the Tsar and the Russian leaders. Um, so within this process of industrialization, the Russian leaders were very often taking advantage of workers and trying to get them to produce as much as possible. Here you can see Russian workers actually throwing a locomotive off of its tracks, basically, which I think is a good symbol for how Russian workers thought of Russian leaders at this time. But the reason why I want to bring this up is because although Russia was big and Russia seemed powerful and Russia seemed to have all these advantages over Europe, it was also pretty poorly organized, and it was also multi-ethnic, and it was also not very well industrialized. With that said, we can go back to our acronym MAIN, M-A-I-N, and look at what Russia had that would lead it to war. It had an authoritarian culture, as we saw from Viking leaders controlling Slavic peoples, as we saw from Ivan the Terrible, and a need for a really strong central ruler, and as we saw from its desire to continually expand, and even it had this separate military class. Alliances, we saw this with Pan-Slavism, cultural ties through the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, and you also had imperialism and expansion. Lastly, nationalism is a little bit problematic with Russia. Yes, you had Pan-Slavism, so the Russian nation wanted to help countries like Serbia. You also have a really rich Russian history, so those who do identify as Russian tend to be very proud of being Russian. But you also have a multi-ethnic empire. And by the time 1917 rolls around, Russia is going to leave the war because it's embroiled in this big, big revolution, which is another lesson entirely.